Okay, the reading for this week is Excerpts from Empress Shu's Instructions for the Inner Quarters. And as always, we'll be using these worksheets that were compiled by somebody at Columbia University, made available online. I'll put the link to the worksheets in the description below this video, and the worksheets, the excerpts from in the worksheets were mostly taken from sources of Chinese tradition, compiled by William Theodore de Berry and Irene Bloom, Volume 1, published 1999, Columbia University Press. So anybody's interested in the subject can purchase that book and follow along using that as well. All right, so for this reading, this week we will be jumping into the Ming Dynasty. Okay, so many of the texts that we've done so far have to do with the Tang Dynasty and the Han Dynasty and so forth. Now we're in a much later period, in the Ming Dynasty, several centuries later. If you still haven't memorized the general dynasty dates for Chinese history, go back and review the video that I made and the worksheets that I handed out and memorize those immediately so you can place the dates as soon as you hear them. All right, Empress Shu, who died in 1407, was the third wife of the Ming Yongle Emperor, who reigned from 1402 to 1424. She was the daughter of General Shu Da, who had played an important part in the campaigns of the Ming Dynasty's founder, Zhu Yuanjiang, the Hongwu Emperor. Empress Shu, who was well-read and of strong character, wanted to write a guide for the cultivation of women. Okay, so we see many of these because Confucius didn't say much in concrete detail about the behavior and virtue and so forth of women. Most of his Lunyu, the Analects, has to do with is directed at men rather. So he doesn't say much about women. So over the centuries, many women and men also have written sort of extensions of Confucian ideas, but expressly for female readership, and this is one of those works. Right, so Yue Zhuzhang, Emperor Shu, who was well-read and a strong character, wanted to write a guide for the cultivation of women. In doing so, she was inspired by the instruction that she received from her mother-in-law, Empress Ma. Empress Ma was a fine role model, a self-educated, well-read woman, a humane ren. Remember, the word for humane is a very important virtue, important idea in Confucian thought, humane and supportive mother-in-law. She viewed herself as sharing her husband Hongwu's responsibilities as ruler and did not back off from offering her advice and criticism to her famously short-tempered husband. What follows are excerpts from Empress Shu's instructions for the inner quarters. And as always, there's a short version in the worksheet and a longer version. I will read from the longer version, but I will first read the questions that we will discuss in class. Question number 1. What aspects of Empress Shu's advice to women are gender specific? Okay, so where is she talking directly to women, and where is she talking more generally to all of humanity? Question number 2. What aspects transcend the boundaries of gender? It's a fairly straightforward question. Question number 3. What are your reactions to Empress Shu's description of the nature of marriage? Okay, so how does she describe marriage, and how does that description of marriage conflict or align with our ideas of marriage today? Question number 4. Compare Empress Shu's advice to women to that of Ban Zhao. What difference and similarities do you find? Do you see any evidence of change over time? Okay, so Ban Zhao is another writer who will address the virtue cultivation of women in another essay, and we'll get to that later in this class, and when we get to that, we will compare that essay with this one. Okay, so here is the longer selection. Excerpts from Empress Shu's instructions for the inner quarters. Preface. As a child, I was well instructed by my parents, reciting such classics as the classic of odes and the classic of documents. So these are two of the 5 documents, or the 5 classics. The Wu Jing, 2 of the 5 Wu Jing. Alright, so as a child I was well instructed by my parents, reciting such classics as the classics of Ode and classic documents, the Shu, and carrying out the details of women's work. On account of the accumulated goodness and blessings of our ancestors, I by chance was chosen to enter the imperial harem. Morning and night I served at court. The Empress Ma instructed all the wives of her sons, especially in the area of proper decorum, Li, and ritual. Remember, Li is propriety, decorum, ritual. Li, very important concept in Confucian thought. I respectfully accepted and tried to carry out her orders. Every day I received instructions from her, respectfully obeyed them, not daring to transgress even one of her rules. I have respectfully served the present Yongle Emperor for 30-some years. In doing so, I have tried to carry out completely my predecessor's, Empress Ma's, wishes by putting into practice her teachings on governance of the inner palace. I often read accounts in the histories, searching for virtuous wives and chaste women of the past. Although they are praised for the greatness of their innate moral nature, their Xing, remember? Xing is the word for human nature. Still, none among them has succeeded without having had some instruction. With the ancients, education had to have some method to it. According to the Li Zhi, or the Record of Rites, which we've already read the first chapter of that, the first book of that very long, sprawling work that is included in the Wu Jing, the 5 classics. According to the Record of Rites, boys at the age of 8 entered elementary school, and girls at 10 received instruction from a governess. But no textbooks for elementary learning were passed down until Zhou. Remember, Zhou is the great Song Dynasty Neo-Confucian thinker of the 14th century who put together the 4 books, the Shu. But no textbooks for elementary learning were passed down until Zhou compiled and edited a text for this level, the elementary learning. It is only in the area of elementary education for girls that there still remains no comprehensive text. There has been a recent increase in publications of female instructions, but better than any of these are the words of our illustrious Empress Ma's instructions, which stand above anything written before and which are well worth being passed down to future generations. I listen to them avidly and store them in my heart. For a person to master sagehood, nothing is more crucial than nourishing one's moral nature, one's Xing, so that one is able to cultivate one's self. Therefore I begin the text with the moral nature, followed by the cultivation of the self. Okay, so that was her introduction to these next 2 parts, the moral nature and the cultivation of the self. First, the moral nature. Being upright and modest, reserved and quiet, correct and dignified, sincere and honest, these constitute the moral nature of a woman. Being filial and respectful, humane, ren, and perspicacious, loving and warm, meek and gentle, these represent the complete development of the moral nature. The moral nature being innate in our endowment, it becomes transformed and fulfilled through practice. It is not something that comes from the outside, but is actually rooted in our very selves. Okay, a very Confucian idea that the moral nature doesn't come from outside, but it's inside us from the get-go, and that we just have to cultivate it and water it so that it will grow, and feed it, and so forth. Of old, upright women ordered their feelings of nature based on moral principle, or li. Okay, it's different from a different kanji from the other character for propriety or ritual, which is also li, but a different kanji. This is the moral principle li. Ohen ni sato te kaite. Li. Upright women order their feelings of nature based on moral principle, moral principle or li, kept control over the workings of their inner mind, and honored the way, the Tao, and its virtue, the Tao Te Ching, the De. Therefore, they were able to complement their gentlemen, their husbands, in fulfilling the teachings of the Tao, the way. The Tao Jiao, the teachings of the way. This is the reason they took humaneness, Ren, to be their abode. So whenever I add I should note that the Chinese words are often not included in these translations. I'm adding them, and whenever you hear me add them, underline that word, because it tells you that this is an important concept in the context of Confucianism and so forth. So this is the reason they took humaneness, or ren, to be their abode. Rightness, yi, remember yi is rightness or correctness or righteousness. Rightness as their path of action. Wisdom, chi, 知道的知, 我不知道的的, 知. Wisdom, but a different kanji actually. But it's still chi. As their guide, trustworthiness, or xing, I think this is xing, as their defense, and ritual decorum, or li, the other li shui de li, as the embodiment of it. Okay, so this sentence there was loaded with the key terms, the key concepts of Confucianism. The accumulation of small faults will mount up to great harm to one's one's virtue. Therefore, a great house will topple over if the foundation is not solid. One's moral nature will have deficiencies if the self is not restrained. Okay, a great house, a house or a building, is a metaphor that's often employed in classical Confucian writings. So, according to Xu Xi, I think, he said that the foundation of the house or the nation or the empire or whatever, the foundation is the people, the masses, the multitude. But here she's saying something else. Moving on. Beautiful jade with no flaws can be made into a precious jewel. Okay, jade, jewel is another metaphor that's often used. Beautiful jade can be made into a precious jewel. An upright woman of pure character can be made the wife of a great family. If you constantly examine your actions to see if they are correct, you can be a model mother. If you are hardworking and frugal without a trace of jealousy, you are fit to be an exemplar for the women's quarters. Okay, the next section is called the cultivation of the self. Now she moves on to this subject. In the way, the Tao, of the ancients, the Guren, the old people of old, in the way of the Guren, the ancients, if the eye looks at evil sights, then one becomes confused inside. If the ear listens to lewd music, one disturbs one's innate virtue, one's innate de. If the mouth utters boastful talk, arrogance takes over the mind. These are all dangers to the self. Therefore, the wife, while at rest, will certainly be correct so as to guard against harm, and when active in household affairs, will show no partialities, so that she can fulfill her moral character. Now, if the self is not cultivated, then virtue will not be established. If one's virtue is not established, rarely can one be an influence for good in the family, how much less in the wider world. Therefore, the wife is one who follows her husband. The way of husband and wife is the principle of the strong and the weak. In the past, the reason why enlightened monarchs were careful about establishing marriage was that they valued the way of procreation and perpetuation. The prosperity or decline of the family, the rise and fall of the state, are intimately linked to this. Okay, so remember that in Confucianism in general, the household, the family, is a kind of microcosm for the entire realm, right? And if you want to get the realm in order, you have to start with the self and then the family and then move outward from there. It's this kind of starting inward and moving outward movement that you see a lot in Confucian writings. Okay, next subsection is called diligence and hard work. Laziness and licentiousness are disasters to the self, while diligence and hard work without any let-up are morally beneficial to the self. Keep in mind that she's arguing not exclusively from the standpoint of society or from the realm or the nation or the empire as a whole, but from this perspective of the self too. Doing all these things is of benefit, is what she's saying. Therefore, farmers labor hard at their crops, scholars at their studies, and women at their work. The classic of odes, so one of the Wu Jing, 5 classics, the classic of odes says, "A woman shall have nothing to do with public affairs, yet she discards her silkworms and weaving for this." End quote. This is a defect that comes from laziness. For persons in low and mean positions, it is easy not to be lazy. It is persons of wealth in high positions who find it hard not to be lazy. You must exert yourself with respect to this difficulty. Do not be remiss in your ease. Next subsection is frugality. The Zhuozhuang says, and there's a footnote about the Zhuozhuang. We'll go over that in class. The Zhuozhuang says, frugality is the precious jewel of the sage. It also says, frugality is the fullness of virtue. Extravagance is the greatest of evil. Okay, zeitaku in Japanese. Extravagance is the greatest of evils, according to the Zhuozhuang. She's quoting from that, and then she begins her commentary. Each strand of silk comes from the labor of some working woman. Each grain of rice comes from the hard work of a farmer. The efforts of that went into the final product were not easily made. The efforts that went into the final product were not easily made. To use these without some sense of limits is to do violence to what comes from heaven, what comes from Tian. There is no greater fault. Now those above lead those below. The inner quarters of the palace are a gauge for the outer world of other women. Okay, so if the the state of affairs inside the imperial palace, in the inner quarters of the palace, are in order, the whole town, the whole city, the whole nation's the wrong word, the whole realm is also in order. Therefore, the Empress must value frugality in order to lead the rest of the palace women. The wives of princes, all the way down to those of scholars and commoners, must honor the value of frugality in running their households. If this happens, then not one person will go cold or starve to death. Rights, Li, and rightness, Yi, will flourish. So Li and Yi will flourish, and the change for the good in people's behavior will merit being recorded for posterity. And the final section here is returning to the good. And the good, keep in mind that Ren, humaneness or benevolence, is often sometimes translated as the good. So I think it might be Ren here. Returning to Ren, returning to the good. Now the principal faults of women are none other than laziness, jealousy, and licentiousness. Laziness leads to arrogance, and then filial respect vanishes. Jealousy leads to harsh treatment of others, whereupon cruelty and avarice take over. Licentiousness leads to self-indulgence, and then one's chastity is ruined. So chastity is a very important female virtue in Confucianism. Sao, something like that. I forget the Chinese reading of that character. And then one's chastity is ruined. These three are all impediments to one's virtue, and injurious to the self. Even if you have only one of these, you should get rid of it as you would a grub, and distance yourself from it as you would from hornets and wasps. So distance yourself from these three vices, right? If hornets and wasps are not kept at a distance, they will sting you. If grubs are not gotten rid of, they will eat your grain. If you don't correct your faults, they will compromise your virtue. And there's, one more subsection here. Looking up to virtuous exemplars of the past. Those who aspire to be sages, Shang, right? Sage is a key word in these writings. Shang is the kanji, we'll go over it in class. Those who aspire to be sages flourish. Those who walk in evil ways perish. If, in taking the ancients as models and trying to emulate them, you equal them, then you can be a sage. Short of this, you can be a worthy. So there's sages at the top, then there's a worthy. And if you're not this successful, you still will not have failed to follow what is good. Pearls and jade are not what is precious to a woman. To emulate sageliness is. Okay, so women should not fawn over things such as pearls and jade. They should seek to emulate sageliness. If your moral character is without any deficiency, you can order well your household. The Ode says, this is the Ode, one of the five classics, the Wu Jing. The Ode says, the high mountain is to be looked up to. The great road is easy to be traveled on. This is what I mean. So kind of straight is the gate kind of idea there at the end. Okay. We'll discuss this work in class, and that is all for now. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.